After the Omicron variant swept the globe in the winter of 2022, things are finally looking up in terms of the resumption of global travel as winter turns to spring. Hold on, I feel like I've said that before. Things are finally starting to look up a little bit in terms of eventually being able to travel again sometime soon. Yeah, this is all getting pretty predictable by now, but as of February 2022, there's once again good news for Canadians who want to travel the world this year in terms of the easing of travel restrictions, which we're going to talk about in this video. We'll also talk about the realities of traveling during this time if you're somebody who's recently tested positive for COVID-19, because after all, the Omicron variant did get many of us, myself included, over this past winter season. And finally, we'll touch upon which countries around the world are finally reopening to tourism after a long wait, in some cases for the first time ever since the start of the pandemic. Quick reminder here that the information we'll cover in this video applies to fully vaccinated travelers only. Stick around to the end of the video to find out what's happening with the third booster dose and which countries are going to be requiring that booster shot very soon. And if you're unvaccinated, then go ahead and turn off the video right now because you're not going to be traveling anywhere anytime soon. And let's get started. Now, the biggest news from recent days that travelers are going to be excited about is the fact that Canada is significantly easing back its travel restrictions. These changes kick in on February 28th, 2022, and in my opinion, they're long overdue, but better late than never. The requirement to take a negative molecular test 72 hours before boarding your flight back to Canada will now be loosened to also allow for a negative antigen test instead. Now, antigen tests are obviously cheaper and more widely available than molecular tests like NAT tests and PCR tests, so that's going to be good news in terms of the convenience of getting that testing option before returning to Canada. Your antigen test needs to be taken at most 1 day before traveling back to the country. Now, notice that that is 1 day rather than 24 hours, which means that if you're entering Canada at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, then you can still take your antigen test as early as 12 a.m. on Thursday and still qualify. And if you're somebody who's been using the test kits by Switch Health since they launched in November 2021, this also means that you can now use the Switch Health antigen test kits for traveling back to Canada instead of the Switch Health RT LAMP test kit. The price difference is significant as the antigen test kit is priced at $79 for 2 tests, while the RT LAMP test kit is $149 for only 1 test. Effectively, it'll soon get quite a bit cheaper to embark on international trips and return to Canada with only an antigen test instead of that more expensive molecular test. What's more, the on-arrival testing requirement for international travelers from non-US destinations that was introduced in December 2021 thanks to the spread of the Omicron variant is now being scaled back as well. Travelers coming back from non-US destinations will no longer be required to take an on-arrival test. Instead, it will be randomized, and even if you do get selected for a random on-arrival test, you no longer need to self-isolate until the results come in. Instead, only if you get a positive result do you then need to self-isolate. And lastly, Canada has taken the step of downgrading our travel advisory from level 3 to level 2, which means that the government no longer advises against all non-essential travel outside of the country. Effectively, we're now back to it's okay to travel internationally as long as you're taking the right precautions. Although, to be fair, it's not like we needed anybody's permission in the first place. And what this also means is that the emergency medical travel insurance benefits on your credit cards are now once again active, because these would have been inactive during an advisory to avoid non-essential travel, and now that that advisory has been repealed, the travel insurance is once again active. Now, Canada's loosening of the arrival testing requirement is good news, but it still might be a challenge for international travel if you happen to test positive either before or during your trip. So what's the reality of international travel for those of you who have recently tested positive? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag with both negative and positive elements. Testing positive for COVID-19, as rough as it can be during the symptomatic period, can actually be fairly useful when it comes time to travel. That's because Canada allows you to use a positive molecular test that's between 10 days and 180 days old to re-enter the country in lieu of a negative test. So if you've recently tested positive for COVID-19, as about millions of Canadians have done, then you might actually have what's known as the golden ticket for traveling outside of Canada and returning to the country without having to do a pre-arrival test. And yes, even though the pre-arrival testing is being loosened to allow antigen testing as of February 28th, you still can use a positive test to bypass that as long as it's between 10 and 180 days old. I myself recently used a positive PCR test from January 2022 to bypass the testing requirement upon returning to Canada after my trip to the Middle East. I simply submitted my positive test PDF file on the ArriveCan app, and then upon landing in Vancouver, I wasn't really asked any questions. I was simply waved through and I got to skip the on-arrival testing as well. A similar thing applies to traveling to the US as well. If you have a positive test within the past 90 days, plus a doctor's note from any doctor saying that you're cleared to exit your isolation period, then you can travel to the US without having to take a negative test beforehand. Note that any licensed healthcare professional can write you this letter that certifies that you've exited your isolation period. This includes your family doctor or the doctor that you regularly see, or perhaps simply a doctor that you happen to know. Otherwise, if you don't know any doctors who can write the note for you and you don't have a doctor of your own, you can always visit a clinic that provides these services with a proof of recovery letter. It'll just cost you a small amount for that service. Simply taking a rapid antigen test kit at home isn't going to count, so make sure to go and get yourself a PCR test if you want that positive PCR test result. Or perhaps this is one of those cases when having a few Switch Health test kits lying around at home is going to come in handy. But even though the testing requirements upon returning to Canada have been loosened, that still isn't helpful for international travel if the places you want to go are still closed to tourism. Thankfully, we have some good news in that regard, with many major countries recently announcing their plans to reopen to tourism, including one major country that has been closed since March 2020, and that's of course Australia. That's right, after an excruciating 2 years of being closed off to the rest of the world, Australia will finally reopen to international tourists as of February 21st, 2022. And the entry requirements are fairly similar to what we're going to have here in Canada. You'll either be able to present a negative molecular test within 72 hours or a negative antigen test within 24 hours before boarding your flight to Australia, and there's not going to be any sort of on-arrival testing or quarantine requirements at all. Australia has long been one of the most closed off countries throughout the pandemic, and so it's so exciting to see them finally open up to international tourism so that we can all start planning our trips down under. Now, I'd love to say that Australia's neighbor New Zealand, one of my favorite countries in the world, is following suit and opening up to tourists as well. However, New Zealand's reopening plan isn't quite so exciting. The Kiwis have rolled out a phased plan to reopen their borders. However, the final phase of that plan still involved a quarantine period for foreign travelers coming into the country. So that's certainly going to be less exciting than quarantine-free travel, and I'd certainly love to see New Zealand opening up those plans even further as we progress through 2022, hopefully with the Omicron variant subsiding even more. There's also even more good news from around the Asia-Pacific region, with another country that's been closed since March 2020, the Philippines, reopening as of February 2022. Traveling to the Philippines will require nothing more than a negative PCR test within 48 hours of departure, and that's another Southeast Asian destination that we can now visit alongside Singapore and Thailand. Once again, that's very encouraging for the rest of Asia potentially reopening later on this year too. Now, certainly one of the most hyped up potential reopenings that we're anticipating this year is of course Japan, which has also been closed since March 2020. And there have been some murmurs that Japan is considering reopening their borders in the coming months as early as March 2022. So if you found this information in this video helpful so far, then make sure to hit the like button down below to send good vibes to Japan for their upcoming reopening, and subscribe to the Prince of Travel channel so that you don't miss any updates in the future about countries around the world finally reopening to tourism once again. Last but not least, if you want to enjoy the prospects of international travel in 2022, then it's important to get your booster shot as soon as possible. That's because many countries around the world have already started insisting on booster shots within the definition of fully vaccinated, and it's only a matter of time before more countries follow suit. The European Union, for example, has already set out a limit of 270 days on vaccination certificates for the purposes of intra-EU travel. And many EU countries have adopted that limit for whether or not they allow non-EU residents like Canadians to enter their borders. Since most of us got our first vaccine doses back in the summer of 2021, that means that by the spring of 2022, it'll be more challenging to travel to Europe if you don't have a booster shot, so make sure to take action on that if you haven't already. But even with Canada easing travel restrictions and countries around the world opening up, and even if you do get your booster shot, that might not all be enough if you do want to travel the world in style this year in 2022. That's because you need to be familiar with the best sweet spots for using your points to travel around the world in business class or first class if you really want to have the best experience while not paying a lot of money at all. And you can go ahead and check out this video for some of the best sweet spots you should book in 2022 before they potentially go away.